Okay? All right, great. I think Kobe just called me a nerd. I'm not really sure, but I think that's what that was. But thanks anyway. I'll take it. In this business, that's definitely a compliment. So just to give a little bit of background, and I know that I guess there's a write-up somewhere, but I am the director of the Behavior Treatment Clinics at the Marcus Autism Center, and my own kind of background really involves working with kids who are exhibiting problem behaviors. And so we have several different clinical services at Marcus that include kind of outpatient clinics where we work briefly with families to provide functional assessments, functional analyses, recommendations and strategies for dealing with problem behavior, all the way up to really intensive day treatment. Kids are there 6 hours a day, 5 days a week, up to a year in some cases of really intensive intervention to try to address some of these problem behaviors, conducting functional analyses and function-based treatments. And so I've been doing this for a while now, and have started thinking a little bit about how I was trained and the background that I have, where the profession is, where that kind of clinical work and that research lies, and been thinking, I don't think I'm quite far enough along in my career, not senior enough to get to be one of those guys who kind of sits back and waxes on where the field's going or anything like that. But I have had a couple conversations with folks over the last year that really I'd like to share and think a little bit about how, as a profession, and for those of us who are working with families and working with individuals with disabilities who engage in problem behaviors, how we might start thinking a little bit differently, or at least I've started to think differently, and maybe some of you are way ahead of me on that front. So I'm just going to start. I work for Emory University as well. I have a faculty appointment, and they require me to make any disclosures, so I have to let you know if I have any conflicts of interest. I don't have any. I'm not getting paid by any of the people who I'm going to present data on or anything like that. So no real conflicts of interest other than you should know my own little background. I do cheer for a couple of football teams, and this can be controversial in the South. So if this might affect how you perceive me personally or any of the information, I'm getting a couple thumbs down from the audience. Yeah, I just feel like I at least need to disclose that much. Getting into the topic, though, and into the content of what we're going to talk about today. I don't think for this audience necessarily, but I oftentimes do have to disclose a little bit about some of the reasons why it's called problem behavior in the first place. And that is, problem behavior is first of all prevalent. It's a big issue for individuals who have developmental disabilities in their families. There have been some estimates that suggest that it's probably the number one problem that individuals who care for people with developmental disabilities deal with. There have been some prevalent studies that have been put out in the past. The numbers vary very widely. I've seen up to 65% estimates. There's 65% of individuals with a developmental disability engage in some form of problem behavior that needs assessment or treatment. I think the numbers by Emerson are probably a little more definitely more conservative, but probably also more accurate. Rohan has done some work in this area as well. But the study by Emerson really suggested that somewhere between 5 and 15% of individuals engage in a pretty significant problem behavior, and that anywhere from 5 to 10% of those folks engage in a form of problem behavior that is significant, that is really the number one issue that particular family or caregivers are dealing with. So it's not a small number of folks. In terms of the impact that this behavior has, obviously these behaviors can cause injury to the individual. Self-injurious behavior is named that for a reason, but also can cause other issues. Other behaviors can cause other problems in terms of physical health. The number one cause of death, for example, amongst folks with autism is accidents. Oftentimes things like accidental drownings, kids who are eloping from home or running away from supervision put themselves at really serious risk. And then it has a huge impact on the quality of life of the families who are caring for these folks. And so I can tell you some of the stories that we hear in our clinic. We hear stories like, my wife and I haven't ever been on a date since our child was born because we can't have anyone else care for them. We hear stories like, we don't go to family functions anymore. So really isolating some of these families because they're caring for a child or an individual who really can't be left alone or with anyone who doesn't know them well. I just watched a video this morning from an observation that one of our clinicians did in the home yesterday, and this was a family who someone has to stay within arm's reach of their son who's about 200 pounds because he just wanders around the house constantly and will slam doors and break them, and so someone basically has to be tethered to this child all his waking hours. And they take turns sleeping in the room. So one of the older daughters will sleep in the room one night, and then a parent, and then the other parent. This is affecting the family in tremendous ways. And even if you take out just kind of the stressors themselves, think about the societal cost of this. These are oftentimes families where one of the parents can't work because they're constantly caring for the child. So it's having an impact even on the economy. So these are significant issues that, fortunately, behavior analysis has established a good track record of being able to make a difference for these families. I always find it interesting to kind of think back and look at some of the older literature. I always find some of the stuff that's been published. A lot of times we're seeing cycles in the literature, things that are being published or research that's being done that really harkens back to an older day. And if you're ever interested in coming up with a good research idea, look back at what was being published 30 years ago or so, and you'll find some of the most interesting research was getting done and has since been kind of forgotten or pushed to the wayside a little bit. So I've always been really interested in kind of how we got where we are with respect to the treatment of problem behavior. One of the studies, and there are many of these types of studies, but early days of behavior analysis, there were many interventions that were being implemented to address problem behavior. There would probably be what Mace would more likely call in his 94 paper behavior modification, overriding natural contingencies that are maintaining problem behavior with powerful arbitrary reinforcers or arbitrary punishers, right? So we can find something that's potent enough as a reinforcer or as a punisher that it might be able to suppress problem behavior regardless of the consequences that might be maintaining it. And then a handful of studies got developed, one of which I think that's kind of representative of these was in 1969 by Lovaas and Simmons. Yes, it's that Lovaas. He did other things. Kind of people don't always know that he did other work. And so Lovaas and Simmons did a study where they had 4 participants who were engaging in self-injurious behavior. It was one of those papers that I kind of find interesting. It's like we had 4 participants and we did 4 totally different things and we decided to stick them all together in a paper. And so 2 of the participants, though, they did an analysis that really was a precursor to what I would think of as today's functional analysis. And so some of you may never have seen kind of a cumulative record in your day. I mean, it's one of those things that we all look back into the textbooks and it's where it all started. But for those of you who are maybe less familiar with a cumulative record, the slope of the line indicates the rate of the behavior. And initially, for this participant, there was a really low rate of self-injurious behavior. And then you can see right about on this third phase, or this third baseline, a little tick mark, and that tick mark represents where attention was delivered following self-injurious behavior. So they delivered attention, no immediate effect really, but eventually some more self-injurious behavior occurs. They start delivering attention following every instance, and you see what happens to the slope of the line. It increases dramatically. They go back to a baseline condition, no reinforcement, no attention being delivered for self-injury, and it flattens out. They go back to delivering attention following instances of self-injury. The slope of the line gets much steeper again, and back and forth. So this isn't what we necessarily think of when we think of an A-B-A-B-A design, but that's exactly what this is. And they're essentially turning the self-injurious behavior on and off by either delivering attention following instances of self-injury or putting the behavior on extinction. And there were similar studies, as I say, by Court, Wolf and Locke and others who really kind of took this idea of we want to see how some of these environmental consequences might affect problem behavior. And they were really at this time mostly looking at aggression and self-injurious behavior, but there were others as well that they looked at this time. So this led to a paper that I think is it's part of the canon. This is one of those things that hopefully everybody's read. If you haven't, I really encourage you to get out there and read it. It's one of these things that it's just like taking your vitamins. You just need to do it because it's good for you. And in '77, Carr published a paper. It was a conceptual paper where he talked about the likely etiology behind self-injurious behavior. And he talked about it from several different perspectives. He talked about it, several different competing theories as to the etiology of self-injurious behavior. So, for example, he talked about the psychoanalytic version of why individuals might engage in self-injurious behavior. It had something to do with low ego strength. I got to tell you, I don't know enough about psychoanalysis to know what that really means, but even so, that was one of the theories that he proposed or that he talked about and discussed in his paper, but he eventually concluded, perhaps unsurprisingly, that self-injurious behavior was likely maintained by environmental consequences, or at least operant consequences, if you include automatically maintained behaviors in that group, but that these consequences were capable of maintaining problem behaviors like self-injury, excuse me, and that it would be the kind of thing that wouldn't be surprising, perhaps, because if you're an individual who perhaps lacks communication, somebody restricts access to something that you really care about, you engage in some problem behavior, that person who cares about you comes over and says, stop hitting yourself, let me turn on your favorite TV program, here, have a cookie, gives lots of attention. These are the kinds of consequences that would likely maintain those behaviors or increase the probability of those behaviors occurring in the future. And so that would be the kind of contingency that would be likely to maintain behaviors like self-injury. One of the more interesting parts of this paper, one of the things that I really love, is he actually talked about in this paper, if somebody really wanted to, what they could do is they could arrange this type of, let's call it an assessment, and an assessment in which certain antecedent variables would be presented. So we might restrict access to attention, for example. And then if self-injurious behavior occurred, we would deliver that attention, and we would look to see the effect of those consequences on behavior. right, on self-injurious behavior to see if it increased. And you might even have a control condition and to compare that to, right? And he said this was something that someone could do if they really wanted to, but you'd never do it because it'd be crazy to reinforce self-injurious behavior, right? Well, about 5 years later, Brian Iwata does something very similar to just that, right? Now, I don't say that to minimize what Brian Iwata did with his functional analysis. There's no question. I think everybody here is a big believer in what he was able to accomplish, and certainly did some things that were very unique in terms of compiling much of this prior literature and the way that these assessments were done into a single assessment that encapsulated a lot of the different contingencies that needed to be evaluated, did it in a very systematic way, proposed a design that oftentimes using things like a multi-element design in order to quickly and efficiently identify the reinforcers that were maintained in problem behaviors. But there was a precedent there. I think that's one of the things that's important that we understand where some of these ideas came from. So this is the kind of graph that I think a lot of us are familiar with looking at, whereas a multi-element design, it shows we can have these different test conditions to evaluate the reinforcers that are maintained in problem behavior. And from this, really come up with how we might go about using these contingencies that are maintaining the behavior to instead maintain more appropriate replacement behaviors, to reduce problem behavior by reinforcing something else that can replace it that's more appropriate, like communication, for example. And I didn't say earlier on, but if there's any questions as we go, please, hands raised, and I think we've got a couple here on the thing, but I'm happy to talk as we go. So I tried to look up before I came here. Those of you may have heard this story before, right? You guys all know Darwin, theory of evolution, all that kind of stuff, right? And that's who we think of when we think of the theory of evolution. What we don't always think about is that there was this other guy who kind of started thinking about the same types of theories early on. And they actually had these two theories they came up with about the same theory at about the same time, but we only ever think about Darwin, right? Darwin's really the only, looking it up, I couldn't even find it within a couple of minutes on Google, so that's about as much attention span as I have with Google these days. So I just moved on, right? And it's like, oh, it's the other guy. We don't even know his name anymore. And the truth is that Iwata had his version of functional analysis, but there were other models that were presented, especially early on. Carr and Durand in particular proposed an alternate method for identifying the reinforcers maintaining problem behavior. And this was in their 85 paper. And again, this is a paper we don't often hear about because they're the other guy, right? They're the ones who oftentimes are thought of when we think of functional analysis. And there are some other reasons perhaps why this model wasn't really latched onto. Their methodology essentially tested for the influence of attention and escape from demands within these different conditions. And so in their analysis, they would have easy or difficult demands in each condition, and then they would either deliver attention in 100% of the session or 33% of the session. And by doing so, you can kind of have a 2x2 matrix of attention versus escape or versus presence of demands. And so then they would look for when the problem behavior would occur. So if you look in the top panel here, you can see in the difficult 100 condition for this participant, that would mean that difficult demands were being presented throughout and attention was being delivered for 100% of the session. This would sound like a kid whose maybe their problem behavior is maintained by escape from demands because it didn't seem to be particularly sensitive to the attention, at least. Now, a couple of interesting points about this. One thing that really was different between this analysis and what Iwata did was they really did not deliver any consequences when problem behavior occurred. It was strictly manipulating the antecedent variable. So presenting the demands, restricting the attention. If problem behavior occurred, they just kept presenting demands, kept on restricting attention. Some folks since then and more recently have referred to this as the A-B model of functional analysis because it's manipulating the antecedent and hopefully the behavior, and contrasted that with Iwata and his version, which would be an A-B-C version of functional analysis. And I'll get back to that later on when we talk about some other more recent research that we've done. So those are the early days, I guess. If 85 is early, I'm starting to feel a little bit old because I was definitely around back then. I can remember, what I was up to in 1985. Probably nothing good. But since the early days, there's been a huge increase in research in functional analysis, in research into function-based treatments. We have functional analyses for a lot of different behaviors. It's been adapted to assess behaviors in different settings. There's some evidence to suggest that the advent of functional analysis is correlated at least with a decrease in the use of punishment-based strategies to treat problem behaviors. So that would obviously be a great outcome of functional analysis. And there's been many different centers and institutions and individuals who've been associated with developing functional analyses and function-based interventions throughout the years. So this is something that is very well established now and definitely in our literature, and to the point where now it's something that's really pretty widely recognized. I think most of us know that even to have a behavior intervention plan in a school, you've got to have a functional behavioral assessment, and that comes from this line of research. So this is where I'm going to start to kind of go outside the box, I guess, and hopefully you'll go with me. if we think about it, there are some things at this point that we're pretty good at, right, as behavior analysts. We are pretty good at figuring out what are the reinforcers that are maintaining a behavior, right? We have lots of different ways to do functional analyses. We can figure it out for lots of different behaviors. We can usually do a good job of figuring out what's maintaining a behavior. We're also pretty good at getting these treatments based on these interventions to work pretty well. And let me just tell you for a minute about the setting that I work in, right? As I said, we have a day treatment program where we're able to bring kids in who are engaging in pretty significant problem behavior. We have specialized rooms that are able to have staff who work with protective equipment if they need that. We're staffed at a 3-to-1 ratio if we need to, so that's 3 staff per kid, not the other way around. I mean, for these kids who are engaged in really serious behavior, they sometimes require that level. We're collecting inter-observer agreement data. We're doing a lot of the things that, like within behavior analysis, we kind of say, yep, those are the practices that we want to employ when we're conducting these types of assessments and developing these types of interventions. And we're pretty good at getting those behaviors under control, especially in those types of settings, right? In that well-controlled environment, that well-controlled classroom. But, right, and you could kind of sense maybe that there was a but coming, right? I think that there's a tendency, and this is where I'm going to go out on a limb a little bit, I think that there may be a tendency within our profession, and certainly within the folks who work in settings like I just described, and I'm including myself here, to say, hey, look, everybody, we made the little line go down. Aren't we all pretty proud? Pats on the back all around, high fives, we made the line go down. We nailed it this time, right? Good for us. The problem is, sometimes we don't ask ourselves the next questions. And I don't mean to minimize how hard it is to make the line go down. I mean, that's a significant thing, right? Like we're excited when we get the line to go down. But I think we're at the point in behavior analysis now and in the treatment of problem behavior to start asking the next set of questions. And those include some things like, is the little line going to stay down, right? Did you make the line go down in some way that the kid's mom is going to be able to keep the line down? Was that the right line to start with, right? Because, when it comes to things like measuring outcomes, for example, we sometimes go with the behavior that's easiest to measure and not necessarily the one that's going to make the biggest impact for that child or that family. So those are some of the things that I'd like to talk a little bit more about for the rest of my talk, if that's okay. And really, I'm talking about what's next. So as I say, we've gotten pretty good at those things, but what's next for us? And really what I'm talking about here is trying to enhance the social validity of the treatments that we're developing that are function-based treatments. And that means a couple things. Increasing the acceptability of our treatments. When we implement a treatment and we say, hey, look, I got the line to go down, does the mom say, that's great, but I'm not doing that, right? Are we really producing outcomes that we are proud of, that we can step back and say, this is going to be something that a year from now, this family's still going to be better off because of what we did? Can we produce good procedural fidelity? Again, if the treatment's so effortful that nobody can do it. And again, I've violated every one of these things, probably this week, right? But I'm saying this is where I'm trying to start going myself, and I'm hoping that maybe I can get you to come with me. And then maintenance, as I said, really making outcomes that are going to be long-lasting. Just a quick definition of social validity. You all, I assume, can read, so I'm not going to read it to you, but I think this is generally what I'm going to be trying to talk about for the rest of the talk here. Is that enough time for everybody? All right. So just a couple of, caveats, or again, these are probably the real disclosures, right? First thing, as I go through the rest of this, I am going to present some data, some of the research that we're undertaking in my lab and with my group of clinicians. And when that's the case, I'll show you those data to kind of, again, we're all behavior analysts here. It's, show me the data. That's what we believe in. For other practices or things that I'm going to be presenting here today, we're in the middle of collecting data. And I'll present to you if we have a little bit of data, or I'll at least talk to you about what we're doing so that you can see that. Maybe data to come. So come see a talk along these lines in a year or two, and we'll hopefully have the data to show. For other things, though, we don't have any data, and I don't plan to obtain any of the data anytime soon. And that's for a reason, right? That's because some of the things that we're doing, I just believe are the right thing to do, right? And we may not be putting the time and the energy into how to do that. Let me give you an example. About 3 years ago, we decided maybe we should start doing follow-up with our families, right? Instead of discharging them, training the parents, and then send them out into the world and never see them again, you know what, maybe we should check on them every couple of weeks just to make sure that the treatments are maintaining and that maybe we're producing meaningful, long-lasting changes. And I don't plan to study whether follow-up made a difference or not, because I just kind of believe it's the right thing to do, if that's okay with everybody. I'm going to try to differentiate between this as I go, though, which of these applies to each of the projects or policies or practices that we're undertaking at Marcus right now. Another thing, just another disclaimer. behavior analysis, as I said, we're very much rooted in our data, and data that's based on observable behavior. And again, I think that's a good thing. I'm not at all going to quibble with that. I do think, though, however, that occasionally we as behavior analysts tend to discount variables that are difficult to measure because they're difficult to measure. Okay? I think that it's possible to conceptualize some of these behaviors of some of the people that we work with in ways that are behavior analytic but are sometimes difficult to measure. For example, a parent's willingness to implement a treatment, right? Now I can conceptualize that in terms of a motivating operation, but it's going to be really hard for me to measure that using direct observation data perhaps, at least efficiently. And so I think sometimes we as behavior analysts tend to just say, well, we can't measure that using direct observation data, so forget about it. We're just not even going to try. We're not going to bother measuring that. We're going to focus on the things that we can measure. And I think we sometimes lose something when we do that. I think when we work with stakeholders that care about some of these things especially, I've been working with a group of folks who are trying to really develop some NIH funding, for example, to try to demonstrate that behavior analytic practices are effective, but the NIH may not always be interested in just what we can prove with directly observable data. They might want to see things like, did people at least verbally report that something was useful to them? And so if we're going to play in that sandlot, we probably need to accept some of those measures as well. I had a conversation with Linda LeBlanc a while back, and I actually was going to present some data along these lines, and I was really nervous, really behavior analytic crowd, and I said, these people are going to crucify me because I'm going to present some data that are based on kind of parent verbally making choices, and you'll see some of those data here today. And Linda, to her credit, she took me aside and said, you don't need to worry about that. Just, present the data. They are what they are. Sometimes we have things that we need to measure and we can't do it directly. And she used this term that I'm going to refer to here. Don't tell everybody, just don't be a data bigot, right? So that's my new phrase. I'm hoping that you won't be data bigots and that you'll follow along with what I'm going to present and be okay with that. So as I said, one of the things that we've been doing at Marcus, at least, I told you when I started working at this program at the Marcus Autism Center, we had a certain set of practices. We did things a certain way, and I think that we produced pretty good outcomes. But many of the things that we've been changing over the last 3 or 4 years have been in this direction of trying to improve social validity. And one of the first things that we decided we really needed to do before we bring a kid in for a functional analysis and a day treatment type of admission, we really needed to stop and do some observation in the natural environment, right? So this is something that, again, maybe for all of you was a no-brainer, but at least for me, having been working in that center for a little while before I kind of was given the opportunity to develop what these strategies would look like going forward, or at least what our strategies were going to be, this was something that we started doing and really has made a big difference. And when I tell my clinicians that they're going to go into the home to do an observation before a kid comes into our unit, I tell them I want 4 things. I want them first to really be able to figure out what are the hypotheses about the function that we're going to try to evaluate. I want them to identify some non-function-based interventions that we can implement right away. I want them to find out what are the barriers to treatment implementation, what's going to stop us from being successful, and I want them to help us figure out how we're going to set the goals for the treatment and what the treatment's actually supposed to do. And I'm going to talk about each of these in a little more detail. The first one, developing hypotheses about the function of problem behavior. As I said, one of the things, I one time was in a talk, and the speaker used the term analog functional analysis, a term many of you are hopefully pretty familiar with. And someone in the audience stood up and they objected to the use of the term analog when referring to analog functional analysis. The argument was something like, well, it's not an analog to a functional analysis, it is a functional analysis. And I had always thought about the use of the word analog a little bit differently. To me, analog in that phrase, analog functional analysis, refers to that we are setting up a condition that's going to be analogous to the natural environment in some way. I give a lot of tours, right? So we have senators, or I gave a tour this week to a Canadian senator. I mean, I knew they had a hockey team, the Senators, but like really Canadian senators coming down, I don't really fully understand what that was about, but I give the tours to who they tell me to give the tours to. And I was explaining to him, what we do, and I said, they walked into the session room, and the session room, as I said, looks kind of austere, right? We have padded walls, we have a padded floor in some of our rooms for the kids who are banging their head. And I said, this is on purpose. We sometimes have people say, well, why don't you paint some little duckies on the wall, make it cute, right? I say, well, we would get the one kid in the world who just hates duckies, right? And we would totally ruin our whole analysis. And so we're setting up these conditions because in the natural environment, when you're a parent and your child has a big tantrum, it's really hard to figure out what the function of that particular tantrum is, right? What's causing that tantrum here today, this moment in time? It could be we're out at the store and because we walked past the toy aisle, or there's candy over here, or there's another kid over there screaming, or it's loud or crowded. There's so much noise, right? Environmental noise, not just literally to your ears, but noise in the sense of signal to noise ratio, that it's hard to figure out where the signal is. It's hard to figure out exactly what is the thing we're trying to isolate in our assessment. And these types of assessments, when we come up with an analog, we're trying to clear away all the noise and find that signal. And so analog in this case refers to analogous to the environment, at least in the ways that matter, right? And so when we go into the home to do this type of assessment, what we're trying to figure out is how can we make these assessments as analogous as possible. I sometimes talk to the trainees that I work with and I say, we want baseline to actually look something like the natural environment, right? Because if baseline looks nothing like the natural environment, then you can get a treatment that looks great, but it's not going to have any relevance to what's going on. And so this means that we try to do things like identify different classes of reinforcers that are occurring in the natural environment, different qualities of attention, for example, different schedules of reinforcement, what are the different motivating operations. Now we all know that the literature on descriptive assessments like this shows that the correspondence with functional analyses is moderate. It's not great. But again, we're using this as a place to start, as a way to develop our hypotheses. And I would also argue that there's been some research, and I'm not going to talk a lot about it here, but it's something that we're starting to break into at our lab in terms of doing descriptive assessments based on lag sequential analyses that allow you to find transitional probabilities. So in essence, given antecedent event A, what's the probability of problem behavior B? And given problem behavior B, what's the probability of parent behavior C? And how are those things related to each other? And I think that as that literature develops and that methodology gets a little more practical, we may see that these types of methods are a little bit better, at least in terms of correspondence with functional analyses. And if you're interested in that, I really encourage you to read the work by McComas et al. And some other folks who've done that work. John Barrero and Tim Vollmer have done some as well. So as I said before, one of the things we're looking for when we do these observations in the natural environment, I tell our therapists, I want to identify at least a couple of interventions that we can implement without doing a functional analysis, right? And the reason for that is, again, thinking at least about the service that I'm talking about. We see these families and we say, all right, yeah, your kid's doing something horrific. They're making your life very, very difficult. They're putting themselves at great risk. Hang on a minute while I do a 3-week functional analysis and I'll get back to you, right? Not exactly what they want to hear, and not exactly a socially valid approach to treatment, I would argue. And so sometimes we can find ways to make a difference for a family right away, not necessarily with a strategy that we're going to tell them to implement for the long term, but at least give them something, right? Let me give you a good example. So we had these twin brothers earlier this year, both engaged in pica, really dangerous pica. I got the x-rays of the things that they had to have surgically removed. One of the things I didn't know about, apparently magnets are kind of dangerous to swallow. And let me be specific. One magnet is not that dangerous. 26 magnets can kill you because what happens is they start working their way towards each other in the gut and they can perforate your intestines, cause all kinds of loops and blockages, really, really dangerous stuff. So we went out to the home to do this observation and we thought, well, we already had it in our minds, we're going to do this functional analysis with pica, we're going to use the Piazza method, we're going to bait the room. We go to the Buford Highway Farmers Market, the Asian market, where we get all the ingredients that don't look like food, but they can consume them, and we bait the room with that, use that methodology. We're all set to do that. When we get out to the house, we have what we call the pica cookbook. It's great. I highly recommend it. Not for your own, but clinical work is great. We get out to the home, we start doing our observation, and one of the things we notice right away is this is a family who, these kids have no structured meal schedule, right? Mom just kind of keeps food out on the countertop. Kids walk around. These are kids who don't speak. They kind of gather food up. They eat while they're walking around the house, and crumbs and junk are just falling all over the floor, right? So right away we're thinking, all right, well, this is not just a pica problem. This is a discrimination problem because when they're hungry later in the day and there's chips on the floor and crumbs, that's what they're going in there eating, right? So a really simple strategy. Yes, these kids need a functional analysis, and yes, they need a function-based treatment, but this family just needs some help on how to keep the floor cleaned up and setting a schedule for meals and having them sit down when it's time to eat and not wander around the house. And that's something that you don't have to wait for. You can do that right away. And that's something that makes things a little bit better while we're going about the rest of our day or the rest of our month figuring out how we're going to treat this behavior. Similarly, a lot of the kids that we see who engage in really aggressive behavior, if we can teach parents things like how to manage those behaviors safely, how to keep themselves safe. We saw a family a couple of years ago. This was a family who said, I'm always shocked when we ask them kind of, how are you handling things? Because they seem like they've got it together, right? They're like, yeah, we're doing okay. It's a little rough. Well, what happens when problem behavior occurs? Well, we take the 2 little girls, the siblings, into the back bedroom, and we barricade ourselves inside. And then about 45 minutes later, we come back out, and we patch the holes in the drywall, and we've taken all the glass out of the house, and we keep the door locked. And so then they go on. And I'm thinking, this is pretty significant behavior. And they're just kind of, yeah, we're doing okay, right? But if we can teach that family just how to keep themselves safe and keep the child safe while we go about doing the functional analysis, that's going to be a big win for the family. Not only enhancing the social validity, but hopefully giving them a little bit of faith in us. We've got a little bit of credibility now as clinicians that we're going to come up with something else. This is just the stuff that we can come up out of our back pocket. We don't have to think about this. We know how to do this. we're going to toilet train your kid while we're at it using Fox and Azure, because that's an easy one, right? And then we're going to work on these other behaviors, which are maybe a little more challenging, take a little bit more time, but at least make your life a little bit better while we work on these things. Identifying barriers to implementation. These are things that, as I said, really are important when it comes to figuring out how we're going to take this treatment down. We do proof of concept, maybe in a clinic setting, but we need to take this on the road and it needs to be able to work. The best example of this I can think of is I know somebody, and I'm not going to name names necessarily, but this is someone that I worked with for a little while, and he was working with a family, brought the kid in, they did a functional analysis, found out that problem behavior was maintained by access to preferred items. Specifically, they used television in their assessment, so showed that the problem behavior was maintained by access to television, developed this beautiful treatment based on FCT. Kid could request television, never saw problem behavior in the clinic as long as he was able to ask for television. Great, right? Bob's your uncle. I think we say that. No, we don't say that anymore? No? Okay, well, he was really excited about that. Yeah, see, 85. So he was really excited about all that. Went to the home to train the family on how to do the treatment. Family didn't own a television. Now, that would have been a really simple thing to figure out with a 10-minute observation in the home, right? And so that's just something that we want to know what's going on, if there are any barriers to implementation. Things like the physical layout of the home, the floor plan can matter when it comes to things like supervision, for example. We saw a child who was engaged in a pica. She'd eaten her windowsill, and they'd had to remove wood chips from her repeatedly. And so we want to see the windowsill. We want to see how the room's set up. Can we do something to increase supervision or make these behaviors a little bit easier to manage, aside from just the types of things that we're going to implement from a function-based treatment perspective? Again, things like family circumstances. We saw a kid who engaged in a problem behavior maintained by attention. Go to the home. There's 8 people living in this 2-bedroom apartment. It's really hard to put a problem behavior on extinction that's maintained by attention when there's 8 people in the home, 6 of whom really don't care very much about what's going on, and they're just kind of there to sleep through the night. So that's just going to be a barrier that we're going to have to address, and I'd rather know that up front than when I spend a lot of time and energy getting a treatment together. And then one thing that we've sometimes dealt with is this issue of what I would call caregiver impulsiveness or discounting, right? So some parents we find from time to time don't value treatments very much, perhaps, and the hypothesis that we went into this with was, again, some of these treatments take time. These are not treatments that we're going to immediately see a big reduction. Sometimes we do. That's great when we do. But sometimes it takes a little while. And I find myself wondering about some of these caregivers from time to time who essentially they got a child who maybe throws tantrums at the grocery store. So they go to the grocery store and they're going down the checkout aisle. And by the way, like whoever is like designed checkout aisles these days, it's like the devil, right? Because like there's candy and toys and all this stuff. Child throws a great big tantrum. And this parent can say, well, I can do what Dr. Call told me to. And 6 months from now, I can go to the checkout aisle and I won't have tantrums. I could just give him the damn candy bar today, and he's going to be quiet now, right? And so this is an issue that we sometimes really worry about when it comes to procedural fidelity. Looks like we've got a question.
Yeah, there's a question online about the PICA cookbook.
Oh, yeah?
I want to know if this is a real thing.
I think it's a trade secret. It's actually, I was sworn to secrecy by the person who gave it to me.
If it's a real thing, everybody wants to know where to get it.
I would suggest looking at the Piazza paper. I think it's 97 where they did the functional analysis of PICA. There is one exception. I wasn't going to go into this, but they asked. There's a recent paper, I think it's 2010, by Hank Rohn, a colleague of mine that I know relatively well. And he gives, in his article, it's in Java, he gives the recipe for analog feces. So if you have a kid who's engaging in coprophagia, and they exist, he gives the recipe. And if you know Hank Rohn at all, I guarantee you he published that paper just to see if he could get that recipe into the paper, right? It's like, it was logs about this size, no corn, like he's going through the whole thing right in the paper. That's part of why I like working with Hank Rohn. Anyway, sorry, Kobe, you can dock me for that one. We're going to be taken off by the FCC, right? So one of the things that we've been using more recently is a barriers assessment. This was developed by Kasdan. Again, this is parent report data. So we take this with maybe a couple grains of salt, but at the same time, if we can see some red flags. So sometimes we present this to a parent, and these are the kinds of questions it's asking. It's just using a Likert scale, not observable data. Again, I feel like I have to give that caveat over and over again. But if I hear a parent say something like, yeah, transportation is going to be really hard for me. I don't own a car, but I do live 50 miles from your clinic. I'm going to maybe wonder about their ability to get there every day, right? If they say something like, yeah, I just lost my job and my husband's unemployed, I'm going to wonder about, are they going to really have the attention to be able to implement an intervention consistently that requires a lot of time and energy? So we look at this as just a way to kind of look for some red flags. These are just a handful of the items on that measure, but as I say, I think that they're representative of, in general, what it's trying to do. And we found it to be helpful for us, at least, and so I would encourage you, if you think it might be useful, to find that. It's published, it's freely available online in the journals. when it gets to this impulsivity that I was talking about before, right, this is that issue of I can do what Dr. Call told me to, or I can just reinforce the problem behavior. We think about this in our literature, at least, or I've started to think about this in terms of delayed discounting. And this is a pretty well-established literature now, this idea that some individuals will choose the smaller, sooner reinforcer in exchange or in lieu of the larger but later reinforcer. And there's been a good amount of work at developing quantitative models to identify this. And I would, again, if you're interested in this, I would refer you to the work of Amy Odom and Leonard Green. There are many, many folks who've done this work, Greg Madden, Howard Racklin, and others who are well known for doing this work and really kind of figuring out the exact quantitative models. There's equations and all that great stuff, so if you're not into math, maybe skip it and just watch this. But in our case, we were interested in this question of, do parents of kids with disabilities who are being treated for problem behaviors discount the value of delayed treatment outcomes? And so we had 17 caregivers who were in our clinic. We used the standard delay discounting paradigm that they use for other things. And most of the time, when people do this type of assessment, they're looking at money. And so that looks something like this, right? So so it's typically they start with something like a choice. They would say something like, which would you rather have, $1,000 today or $1,000 tomorrow? Who wants the $1,000 today? Some of you are not raising your hands. That would be really weird. But hey, all right? So $1,000 today, $1,000 tomorrow. Most people, I'll take $1,000 today, right? Same amount of money, why not? All right, what about $990 today or $1,000 tomorrow? Who wants the $990? All right, Kobe, he's the one, right? He's the impulsive one in the room. But most of you somewhere in there made a switch, right? You switched from the 990 to the 1000. We would call that an indifference point. And that's in the literature. What you can do is you ask the same question at different delays. So we start out at 1 day. What about 1 week, 1 month, 1 year? You keep going and you find these different indifference points at these different delays. So that looked kind of like this. In our case, we were asking about treatment outcomes though, right? We said, what if I could give you 2 different treatments for your kid's problem behavior? Treatment A is going to reduce your kid's problem behavior for 10 years. You're not going to have any problem behavior for 10 years, and the treatment works right away. Treatment 2 is going to produce the same effect, but it's going to take 1 week. Everybody takes right now, right? Why wouldn't you? If I can have the same outcome, I'll take the treatment that has the long outcome immediately. What about a treatment that produces 9 years, 10 months with no problem behavior that takes effect now? Or treatment B that starts in 1 week, 10 years? We see that that's where the switch starts to happen. We find these indifference points. Now we do the same thing, but we're doing it at a different delay, 10 years now versus 10 years in a month. They're going to go back. They may actually go for the 9 years, 10 months at this point, if the treatment's going to take effect now, but eventually we're going to still see that indifference point. What we see is for each of these participants, these are their different switch points, right? So each one of these points represents, kind of plotted out, where they switched at the different delays. So the delay is along the x-axis in this case, the point of indifference. One way to think about this is how high it is on the x-axis, or on the y-axis, represents the percentage of the treatment's original value that is retained at that delay, right? So for example, you could say for this participant right here, at about a 100-day delay, a 100-week delay, a treatment only retains about 10% of its original value, all right? Now that's a parent that really makes me nervous. That's a parent who says, this treatment's got to work today, my friend, because if it doesn't, it's of almost no utility to me. I have no use for it if it doesn't produce its effect within about 3 months. Right? If it's not going to, otherwise, I have no use for it whatsoever. We have other parents up here who are saying, you know what? I'm in it for the long game. If it takes 10 years to produce a treatment that has a lasting effect, I'm down with that. I will go for that. And so these are the kinds of things that we're starting to try to assess a little more systematically. As I say, these 2 parents are the ones that we really are interested in if we can start to group these parents differently. One thing that was interesting, by the way, and this is just kind of a side note, this is a parent who we saw the parent of the child was younger, had an autism diagnosis, and the father was a physician, and they had tried like every treatment under the sun, right? They had done HIPAA therapy, they had done hyperbaric oxygen, they had done chelation, they'd flown him to Poland at one point to do who knows what. The father, as I say, was a physician, so they'd done a lot of uncontrolled medication trials, if you will, and they were trying a new treatment like every 3 days. And I started thinking about, man, has that got anything to do with these types of data that we're seeing right here? So we've started to do these same assessments now with not just parents of kids who are engaging in problem behavior, but parents of kids who are having their kids treated for skill acquisition. Basically the kids that Alice presented earlier, same kids, like their parents in that clinic were doing the same type of assessment. And instead of asking them about treatments in terms of how long the problem behavior won't occur, we ask it in terms of percentage of their treatment goals. And what happens when you do that, looks a little bit differently, right? We're asking them in terms of what percentage of their treatment goals they want to have met. These are the data when we compare those two. So the red line here represents the parents of the kids who are engaged in self-injurious behavior and other problem behaviors. The blue line represents the parents of the kids who are there for skill deficits. And what we're seeing is the parents of the kids who are there for problem behaviors are more impulsive when it comes to treatment. Just something that we have to keep in mind as we're designing these treatments, that these are parents who may not be able, at least, or may not be likely to be in it for the long haul. And so we have to really think about that when it comes to treatments, right? One of the things we know from a paper that came out by Wacker and Nevin in 2011 is that treatments like functional communication training can take a long time to produce lasting effects. You know, Dave is a mentor of mine, and I remember him talking at length one time about how we use things like reversal designs when we develop treatments. And we'll be able to turn the problem behavior off by putting treatment in place, and then we reverse and the problem behavior comes right back. And his take was, well, maybe we need to think about this a little differently. Maybe the fact that we can reproduce problem behavior so rapidly after having a treatment in place is not that we have great experimental designs, it's that we have weak-ass treatments. That's a quote, so I get away with that one, right, Kobe? Right? It's the idea that your treatments may not be that powerful if you are able to go back to a baseline condition and see problem behavior reemerge immediately. And so this was a study that they did where essentially they would go do a reversal and wait and see how long did they have to do treatment before they didn't get the reversal. And in many cases, it was up to almost a year or more before they saw FCT producing that kind of effect. So if we're going to go to caregivers and say, yeah, we got a treatment for you, we can turn the behavior on and off. Isn't that great? All right, keep this up for a year, and then we'll get back to you, and that should be fine. If these are parents who are telling us that these treatments don't have much value for me if it's not going to produce an effect within 100 days or 100 weeks or whatever, then that's something that we really want to keep in mind as we design these treatments. So the goal would be to try to anticipate these types of challenges ahead of time and design treatments that account for them. I've talked a little bit about functional analysis already, and in particular, the methodology that was developed by Iwata and colleagues is the one that's well known. But there are other methodologies. I've talked about the A-B version of functional analysis, but also the brief functional analysis. And again, I've already spoken a little bit about Dave Wacker. And I'm sorry, getting ahead of myself a little bit here. But Bauman, Marcus, Ringdahl, and Rohn in '95, they published a really well-known paper that talked about progressing from brief analyses to more lengthy analyses, and in particular being able to identify the function rapidly and efficiently so that we can move to treatment as quickly as possible. And Dave and his group really developed this strategy, this brief functional analysis methodology. To hear Dave Wacker describe it, he was at the University of Iowa, and basically he was in a department of psychology, pediatric psychology, and they all had different clinical responsibilities, and someone came around and said, all right, everybody has to do an outpatient clinic. I don't care what you do, you have to do an outpatient clinic. Dave had always done day treatment or inpatient type services. All right, we got to do an outpatient clinic. What are we going to do on an outpatient basis that's going to be helpful for families? And the brief functional analysis really came out of that motivating operation, the need to develop something where we're going to have 90 minutes with a family. What can we do in 90 minutes that's going to be helpful to somebody? And there were a lot of adaptations to the functional analysis methodology that really made it more amenable to that type of clinical venue. Running shorter sessions, 5 minutes instead of 10 or 15, for example. One of the keys is having the caregiver run the sessions instead of a novel therapist. You think about it, right? That caregiver is probably a discriminative stimulus. They've probably been paired with reinforcement for whatever the functional reinforcer is. And so if you can have a caregiver running the sessions, you're more likely to see the problem behavior more rapidly. And then the other thing is running these as more of a hypothesis testing format rather than a multi-element design like is commonly the case with the functional analysis that's a little bit longer. Within a multi-element design, we're really relying upon randomization. Randomization is a good thing when we have a week to run a functional analysis. We take our time and we say we're going to randomize, run a series, re-randomize, run a series and re-randomize. And each time we do that, we're counting on randomization to take care of any of that noise that I talked about earlier, right? Because it should apply equally as long as we're randomizing all these things. But you got 90 minutes, you don't have time for that. And so one of the key changes that came about with this brief functional analysis format was to run the conditions in a sequence that really best tested the hypothesis that the therapists had, or that the clinicians had going into this. So for example, if you're going to start with a toy plane condition, you might run tangible next because you've already set up that MO by providing access to the preferred items for that toy play condition, and then running those test conditions in a sequence that best tests that hypothesis. So Kong and Iwata in '99 then compared brief functional analyses to these more lengthy or more traditional functional analyses. I hate the term extended functional analysis. I don't really know what that means. But compared these and found that, and the way that they did this was it was interesting and I think pretty creative. They took a functional analysis that they had run in their inpatient unit at Kennedy Krieger, that took weeks and weeks perhaps, and then just pluck the first session from each condition out, line the data points up, and basically say, all right, this is equivalent to a brief functional analysis. From this, we're going to compare that to what the functional analysis that took longer actually concluded. What they found was that there was about 66% concordance, which is not perfect, but pretty good. If you got 90 minutes with somebody and you're going to try to develop a strategy, that's probably better than what you can get out of a lot of indirect assessments, some of those questionnaires that might be the alternative. It's probably a pretty good way to go. Now, there are some limitations to this, right? One thing I would argue is that by just pulling the sessions out that were originally run in a random sequence, you're not really doing a functional analysis. Secondly, or at least a brief functional analysis as it was originally proposed by the Iowa group. The other thing is, as I said, you typically don't just run one of any one condition. You might run one of a condition that you don't see problem behavior, but you're often going to try to replicate things. And so there were some differences between this format and the types of brief functional analyses that are typically run in outpatient settings. We were interested in this question also in combination with the idea that I talked about earlier with the Carr and Durand paper, where they looked at functional analyses that followed that A-B as opposed to ABC model. And so if you remember, the A-B model is where they just manipulated the antecedents, but they didn't deliver any consequences when problem behavior occurred, so no reinforcement. And Worsdale did a study where they evaluated the ABC and the ABC model, and in essence ran different test conditions of the functional analysis, some of which manipulated just the antecedent and some which manipulated both. And there were other conditions, but generally what they concluded was if you do that, you're likely to get a false negative, that you'll see instances where no problem behavior is occurring. And that makes sense in a longer functional analysis, right? Because you're not delivering any consequences as a result of the problem behavior. It's essentially extinction. You would expect it to decrease over time, right? What we were interested in our clinic was this idea that perhaps these brief functional analyses actually have some merit and we could potentially still use that A-B methodology, but within a brief format. And here's why we thought that might be a good idea. In a brief FA, we're not as reliant upon learning, right? In a functional analysis that's going to take weeks and weeks, you're essentially letting the child learn the contingencies through just exposure to them, right? So I hit somebody and someone gave me attention. Attention's not that valuable. I'm going to keep going on with my day. Wait, in this situation, I hit somebody, they gave me a cookie. Next time we're in this situation, I'm going to hit again, right? And their behavior comes under the control of that contingency. In a brief FA, there's not the time for that. We're running 5-minute sessions. We're maybe probing each condition a couple of times. We're probably more reliant on the antecedent in this type of analysis than on the consequence. That is, somebody took my stuff away. There's a history of engaging in problem behavior when people take my stuff away. Problem behavior occurs, yes, it's on extinction, but it's only on extinction for a couple of minutes, and then we go on to the next thing. And we're only going to test this out a couple of times. We may be able to see problem behavior more reliably. And that's exactly what we saw. If you look at these data, we ran functional analyses two ways. These are the same kids that are horizontally presented here, the same sequence of conditions, and what you'll see is that they generally matched. We got similar results. I know it's kind of small. What we saw was that we produced the same outcome for those functional analyses regardless of whether we were doing the AB or the ABC model. What you may also notice, though, is that on the left, the data points tend to be a little bit higher. Those were the AB model of brief functional analysis instead of the ABC. And this was why we thought this might be potentially useful. Because in a brief FA, it's all about, can you have a strong independent variable? Can you produce an effect quickly because you only got 90 minutes to do it? And what we found was that, especially in this case right here, right, we're seeing 100% of the trial, or the intervals, for example, we're seeing problem behavior compared to over here. That could be for a couple of reasons. One is that there's an extinction burst going on, right? The problem behavior, you took my stuff away, problem behavior occurs, and the stuff doesn't come back, and so the problem behavior escalates. The other might just be that they're spending 100% of their time in the presence of the MO, whereas in a regular functional analysis, or an ABC model of functional analysis, you're delivering the consequence, and when I get my stuff back, I calm down for a couple of seconds until you take it away again. So from this, we really conclude that these types of analyses have a lot of merit, have a lot of utility, and especially can increase the social validity because we can do them quick. If we can do these things and they're valid, we're able to identify treatments rapidly, we can produce good outcomes for families, and in a way that probably is a little more socially valid. Another important thing that we've been trying to do a little bit better in our clinical services is establishing clear goals for treatment. When we first start working with the families for a long time, our pattern was they come into the clinic and we say, well, we're going to do what it always says in the literature, which is we achieved an 80% reduction in problem behavior. That's going to be our goal. We want to see an 80% reduction in problem behavior. Truth be told, though, that's not always the outcome that a caregiver really cares about, right? PICA only takes one. So you can see an 80% reduction in PICA, but if that kid swallows one screw, it's going to kill him. 80% is probably not a very meaningful outcome. It's also something that we found caregivers really don't know what that means. When we say, hey, we want to achieve an 80% reduction, is that cool with you? They say, sure. but they don't really know what 80% looks like from their perspective. So we've just started trying to, and this is one of these things we don't have a lot of data on this at this point. This is just something we think is the right thing to do. But when we talk to the families, we say, well, how would your life be different if this treatment was successful? What would be different if I had a magic wand, and I don't, by the way, but if I had a magic wand, I'd have a church, not a clinic. That's usually what I tell them. But if we had a magic wand, how would your life be different? Well, I'd be able to go to the store and not hold his hand the whole time. I could leave him with grandma, and grandma wouldn't call me to come pick him up because she's getting hurt today. He'd be able to be at school and master a couple IEP goals, because right now they're not doing anything with him, right? Those are the kinds of goals that we're asking our parents about now, and they're harder goals, right? 80% is a little bit simpler. It's we can say, hey, look, we got our baseline, 80% of that, but all right, now we got to stop and think about, well, if he's going to be with mom or with grandma, what does that mean treatment needs to look like? Well, it probably can't be a 15-second DRO, because she's not going to do that, right? Same thing when we talk about things like elopement. We've recently started seeing a lot of kids with elopement for whatever reason. And initially we were saying, hey, look, we got the little line to go down, right? We got the kids staying within arm's reach of the therapist while they walk around our unit. We even went to the store, and they did that too. But if we think about elopement as an example, what does real success look like? Well, my kid's safe, right? Well, that means more than just he stays within arm's reach when we're walking around with a therapist. That means he can tell somebody his name and address when somebody asks him. That means he can cross the street safely and identify an intersection okay, right? These are all the things that are important. He can tolerate wearing one of those ankle bracelets so the sheriffs can find him if he gets lost in the woods and can't tell anyone his name, right? These are all of the things that go into a treatment being really effective that go far beyond 80% reduction. And so this is just something that we've started trying to do. And again, I don't know if it's of any value to anybody else, but Kobe told me I could talk about whatever I wanted. And so this is what's been on my mind lately.
Is that what I said?
Something like that, yeah. We're going with that. Let's see. I'm going to move along. One of the things we started doing as well is just kind of examining functional analysis and the social validity of the analyses we conduct on their own. As I said, there's no question that functional analysis is a well-established methodology, but we sometimes wonder the degree, we started to wonder the degree to which the problem behavior we saw in the clinic really matched up with what we were seeing in the home. And so we just started asking two really simple questions. We started asking the caregivers, we just ran a brief functional analysis in this case. I think we've had something like 60 or 70 parents who've taken this questionnaire at this point. And we say, we just ran an FA with your kid. The parent was the therapist in most instances, so they saw the behavior pretty upfront in their face. Tell us, of all the things that we saw here today or throughout the analysis, the worst instance of problem behavior that we saw compared to what you see at home. Is this average, typical, what have you? You can see the question along the bottom. Or the worst behavior we saw in the session, how did it compare to typical, right? So it could go from no problem behavior was a 0 to what we saw in the clinic was worse than what they typically see at home. Just something I was curious about. I say these data haven't really been presented anywhere, but just if you can read these, essentially what we found was very few, if any, people said that what we saw in the clinic was worse than what they're seeing at home. In most instances, they're saying, number one, yeah, we saw a little bit of problem behavior, but it really doesn't scratch the surface of what I'm dealing with at home on a daily basis. That has implications for us in two ways. Number one, we want to be really careful now that we don't assume what treatment needs to look like based on the level of problem behavior, the intensity of problem behavior we're seeing in an analog FA, because it may not really be the same kind of problem behavior that they're seeing on a daily basis. Now, there's probably some pretty good reasons for this, right? One is that we tend to reinforce on an FR1 schedule and parents don't. So problem behavior at home, kid starts whining, maybe they throw something, parent tries to ignore, they get the sister in a headlock, parent still ignores, then they tip over the TV, and now there's a lot of attention that's being delivered, right? And in the clinic, yeah, we'll reinforce the throwing. So we never get to tipping over the TV or any of that kind of stuff. So there's probably good reasons for that. But I think it's just important that we keep this in mind as we do these assessments and develop these treatments, that we may not have a clear picture of exactly what they're dealing with on a daily basis. And so we shouldn't make assumptions about how easy or hard treatment might be based on the level of behavior that we're seeing in the clinic. Yeah?
Microphone.
Oh. Jerry Springer.
Faster this time.
It looks like, if I'm reading this right, the number 1 is the most...
The modal response, yes.
Okay, so some problem behavior, but not comparable
To what I see at home. That's right.
But not comparable in which direction?
Low, on the low side. I mean, we tend to say, this is comparable to what I see at home, this is similar, this is worse, this is problem behavior that, and one of the issues is, as I think you may be pointing out, this is self-report data, and it's very subject to how people interpret it, right? So this is just something that we're kind of curious about, we're interested in. I don't think this necessarily is anything that we're going to publish anytime soon or anything that is necessarily going to be life-changing or world-altering. It's just something that we're a little bit interested in. Most of the parents are saying, this doesn't seem to be comparable or comparable to what we're seeing at home. It doesn't seem to be as bad. And we do a little debrief with them as well. We sit and talk to them afterwards, and we kind of ask them in a kind of a free form, well, tell me a little bit more about how it differs.
So what you're seeing is not as bad as what they're seeing.
That's right. Yeah. I'm going to move along just because we're probably going to run out of time at some point. And if I do, I apologize if we don't get through all the slides. I was telling Kobe, I wrote this talk wanted to over-prepare and not leave myself too much time at the end, but we'll make sure that we leave time for questions as well. So another set of studies that we've been interested in, we sometimes get this question. I don't know if any of you have dealt with this when you've done a functional analysis like in a classroom or anything like that. We sometimes have the issue of we're reinforcing problem behavior. You remember jumping back to that paper by Carr that I talked about earlier. He said, if you really wanted to, you could run something that looks a lot like a functional analysis, but that'd be crazy to do that because that'd be reinforcing self-injury, right? And the implication of that is that, and there's good reasons why we reinforce the behavior and typically on a dense schedule. We typically do that because it establishes that strong contingency between behavior and consequence, and that's something that really helps with identifying the function. It may set up treatment success down the road by making it more susceptible to extinction. But we hear the parent saying things like, wait a minute, you're going to do what exactly? You're going to reinforce self-injury? Isn't that exactly the wrong thing to do? And as I said, Carr raised this issue as well with the question about reinforcing these types of challenging behaviors. Now, one way to address this is to just be careful about the setting, right? So if we do an analysis in a clinical setting that's clearly completely different from the setting in the home, well, there may be enough discriminative control by having a room that's blue with padded walls and padded floor that we may not see a lot of generalization to the natural environment. But it certainly is the question that the caregivers essentially are asking is, wait a minute, if you reinforce problem behavior, am I going to have to deal with this when I take him home at the end of the day, right? Or if you're in the classroom, you're going to do a functional analysis and you tell the teacher, yeah, we're going to go ahead and we're going to give him cookies every time he punches you. They may not like that idea very much. And they may be thinking, well, what happens when, or may say, what happens when I take him back to class at the end of the day or tomorrow because we've done all this reinforcing of problem behavior. As I say, the setting could be really instrumental in trying to attenuate this particular problem. But really what we're talking about here is potentially an interaction effect, right? So you think about when we do a functional analysis like this in another setting. So the parents got the kid at home, they bring him to the clinic, we implement the functional analysis, we're reinforcing problem behavior on an FR1 schedule, or we take them out of class, go into another classroom or something like that, we implement the functional analysis, we're reinforcing problem behavior on an FR1 schedule, and then they go back to class or back to home, and there's presumably some more intermittent schedule of reinforcement in that setting. That's the definition of a multiple schedule, right? Two schedules of reinforcement that alternate with discriminative stimuli associated with each, right? And Reynolds did some work where he talked about how changing one schedule of reinforcement, producing a change in behavior in the other component of the multiple schedule is what we call an interaction effect. Specifically, induction in the case of you increase the rate in one setting, you see an increase in the other setting, that would be an induction, or we would call that induction. And so that's essentially what the caregivers are saying. They're just saying, we have really well-educated parents who know a lot about behavior analysis, and they come up to us and they say, I'm really worried about induction of problem behavior to the natural environment. Well, we figured out. So Shabani recently, just this year, published a paper where they did some work looking at this issue. They did this again in a school, and they ran a functional analysis, but they measured the rates of behavior before and after sessions. And what they found was for many of the kids in the natural environment, so they measured the behavior in the classroom, take them to another classroom, run functional analysis sessions, bring them back, and when they brought them back, they saw slightly elevated rates of problem behavior, potentially suggesting some of this induction may have been what was going on. Now, they didn't control the contingencies in that environment at all. It was just whatever the teacher was doing in the original setting. So there were some limitations to that study. And so we were interested in this as well. We had 11 participants in our study. engaging in a variety of different problem behaviors. And we set up, again, more of an analog type of a setting. So for us, we've got this intensive day treatment setting, and we broke up their entire day into time they either spent in the functional analysis setting, which was a session room, like I said, blue, padded walls, padded floor, and the like, or on the unit. And for our purposes, on the unit meant everywhere else. So that meant in the lunchroom or in the hallway or the restroom or when they first got there, right? So we split their entire day into these two settings. The dependent variable in this study was the amount of problem behavior we saw on the unit, right? So what happens when they start out on the unit, they spend their time there, and then we're going to make changes in the functional analysis setting, but we're going to keep everything on the unit constant. So in the, we're measuring the amount of problem behavior we saw on the unit as an analog to that other classroom, the home, whatever, the setting to which the caregiver might be worried about problem behavior increasing. As I say, we kind of ran these different probes on the unit where we took data at 5 different activities for 10 minutes. It was first 10 minutes that they got there, where they're putting their bag away, putting their lunch away, that kind of thing. Bathroom break, lunchtime, free time, and then when they were getting ready to leave at the end of the day. During their entire time here, the schedule of reinforcement on the unit was a VR3. So we thought that's kind of approximated more or less an intermittent schedule, which might be the kind of thing you would expect to be going on in the natural environment when they're at home or when they're in a classroom. Again, this being an analog to that. Now, the consequence that we delivered, we had to be a little bit of a detective, right? And I know there's at least one person in this room who helped run this analysis. And so she can speak to this after the fact if there's any questions about this. But we had to kind of infer from the child's behavior what the likely reinforcer was. So, for example, if we were restricting attention and problem behavior occurred, we would make sure that we delivered attention. If they were reaching for an item and we prevented access to that, we would deliver that item, again, on that VR3 schedule. If there were demands present, we would give a break. So again, everything on the unit staying constant. Within the functional analysis setting, we ran an FA. We originally started out with a baseline condition where we weren't changing anything. So the first day or 2 or 3, they arrive, we're doing consent forms, we're getting the nurse to take their blood pressure, all that kind of stuff. We're doing a lot of things, we're doing preference assessments, a lot of things other than doing a functional analysis. And at a certain point, that all stops and we start running the functional analysis instead. So it looks kind of like this, right? We've got the treatment room or where the functional analysis is going on. Initially, we're doing all that other stuff, and problem behavior is on extinction in that setting. Then we go to run the functional analysis, which means that the schedule of reinforcement is an FR1. Meanwhile, it's a VR3 constantly on the unit. And these are the data that I'm going to show here today, right? So these data are published in a journal. I can give the reference later if I can remember it. But in essence, we were looking for what changes might happen. And the good news is it doesn't seem like there's huge changes necessarily. What we did see was that for at least one participant, it seemed like there was actually a drop, right? So this was what was going on the unit before we started the functional analysis in the other room. Once we started the functional analysis in the other room, problem behavior on the unit really came down a little bit. So instead of induction, what we're seeing here is what Reynolds would call contrast. For other participants, this case, it didn't seem to make a lot of difference. Here, we probably saw what looks a little bit like an increase. So this would be more like the induction that we were a little bit worried about. Here, probably no difference. We've run this with about 8 additional kids. And what we tend to find is data kind of like, I'm sorry, I showed these individual participants. Overall, we've seen that for 4 out of our 20 participants, we've seen an increase in problem behavior, a noticeable, measurable increase in problem behavior when the functional analysis was conducted. We actually saw reductions for 2 of the 20, though. And by far, the most common result was no change. There didn't seem to be a big difference. And so from our perspective, this lets us at least prepare parents. Parents say, you're going to do what? You're going to reinforce self-injurious behavior. And we say, you know what? Yes, it's possible that there could be an increase. But not only could there be an increase, you might see a decrease. And by far, the most common thing is we're probably not expecting a lot of change in the natural environment because we're doing a functional analysis in this condition. Now, there are obviously some limitations to this study. As I said, it's an analog setting. It wasn't exactly the same as home versus a clinic. Also, we decided that initial baseline was based on what was clinically relevant. However long it took us to do the preference assessment and the paperwork and all that kind of stuff, once that was done, we started the functional analysis. We didn't wait around till we had the right trend and all that kind of good stuff. And then the last thing is that a multiple baseline isn't really ideally detected or ideally designed to detect differences that take a little while to achieve. Or to show that something didn't happen, right? That's one of the most common result was that nothing changed. Multiple baseline design isn't great for showing that kind of thing. But as I said, this gives us some information about what we need to tell caregivers about as we prepare for conducting the functional analysis, and hopefully let them know what they can expect. When it comes to, so how are we doing so far? It's like almost 3:36. You guys have been here how long exactly? 2 days. 2 days? Man, I think I'm worn out. I can't even listen to myself anymore. I can't imagine you guys. Wow. I'm going to talk just briefly about some other stuff that we've been doing with functional communication training. FCT. I mean, it's the wonder treatment that works wonders, right? I mean, it's that treatment that probably more than anything else for socially maintained problem behavior is utilized. I think Tiger had a paper in the last 5 years or so where he showed it was one of the most well-established treatments for function-based treatments in the literature. So there's a lot of research out there to say FCT is great, but one of the things that we worry about sometimes is, I don't know about you, but I don't live in the world where everything I ask for, I get it, and I get it immediately, right? And that's essentially what we're doing when we implement functional communication training. We're saying, all right, kid engages in problem behavior. We're going to replace that with appropriate behavior on some FR1 schedule, at least initially. And FR1 schedule, that's not the world that I live in, and that's not the world that most of the caregivers that we work with live in. Oftentimes, these reinforcers aren't available, especially immediately. And in some cases, that rate of consumption is just not a good idea, right? If they're requesting food all the time, you can't give them food every time they ask for food. That's not necessarily even healthy. But then at the same time, if you don't reinforce that communicative response, you worry about resurgence. There was a paper by Volkert and colleagues in 2009, I think, that showed that if you place a behavior that was on it, if you place an FCT response on extinction, you see resurgence of problem behavior. Good paper. In any case, there's been a fair amount of literature really since the year 99 or 98, where they started using, again, this idea of using multiple schedules. But in this case, multiple schedules as a way to bring requests under stimulus control. So that rather than the individual being able to just request something at any time on an FR1 schedule, being reinforced on an FR1 schedule, alternating between periods of availability and unavailability. And typically there will be some stimulus that will be paired with those periods of access or non-access. The SD and the S delta in this case. We tend to use kind of what appeared in the literature when Hanley and those guys did some of this initial work. A green card is the SD, so when the green card is present, if the child emits a demand, they receive access to that item. When the red card is present, that's the S delta. If they ask for the thing, whatever it is in the presence of the S delta, then the reinforcer isn't delivered. And this has been shown to produce pretty good outcomes. Again, there have really been a handful of papers on this, some looking at can you use more naturalistic discriminative stimuli, but in general, folks find that you can get to a pretty good period of time of S delta for relatively brief FCT. So for example, 15 minutes of no access for a 30-second period of access, that's something that a parent can live with, right? That's, hey, you know what? The kid's not engaging in any problem behavior. He gets 30 seconds to ask for whatever it is that's preferred, and then I go back to cooking dinner for 15 minutes before I have to present that SD again. And that's a more manageable and, again, socially valid version of FCT, or extension adjunct to FCT. And as I say, in the Hanley and Iwata paper, they got up to something like a 15-minute or a 10-minute interval, and they were pretty successful there. There are some limitations to this literature, though, right? These periods of access, the SD and the S delta, the intervals, are kind of arbitrarily chosen. They typically, in the literature at least, have been using 15 seconds of SD for 45 seconds of S delta. And yeah, they may thin the schedule over time, but there's no particular reason why those durations, why 15 seconds and why 45 seconds, right? And again, you can see these published in the literature. They've done a nice job. They published their successes. There's definitely some successes in the literature. But as we started trying to replicate this in our clinic, what we found was there were lots of kids where it wasn't working, and we started to wonder why. This is something that's going to be really important to making these treatments socially valid, but we were struggling to have these MANs come under discriminative control or keeping problem behavior low when we implemented this type of procedure. So as I said, we started first wondering about how we would set that initial interval. The problem might be, for example, and what we thought might be going on is you get these behaviors where the MO doesn't come to strength that rapidly, for example, right? So the motivating operation doesn't only rises to strength sufficient to evoke a man maybe once every 3-4 minutes. But if you're switching every 45 seconds and then 15 seconds and then 45 seconds, you're seeing a lot of times go by where they're not contacting that contingency, right? The other issue is the presentation of the SD is likely to become a conditioned reinforcer, right? Because when the green card comes out, now's my chance. Now I'm asking for my stuff, or I'm asking for attention or breaks or whatever, right? So when the green card comes out, the SD, that's likely to become a conditioned reinforcer. And if problem behavior occurs immediately before the SD is presented, you're potentially adventitiously reinforcing that problem behavior. So we got into this idea of we want to be able to figure out a way to establish a multiple schedule using these set intervals that made sense, that were based on something other than just the arbitrary 45, 15, and also make sure that we weren't adventitiously reinforcing problem behavior. So far, we had about 8 individuals participate in this study as well. All the participants' problem behavior was maintained by positive reinforcement, so they were all asking for stuff in this case. And this is what that looked like. We start out with a baseline on the top panel. This is going to be problem behavior. On the bottom panel, this is going to be mans. And in the baseline condition, this is what you'd expect. Lots of problem behavior, no mans. When we first go to the initial functional communication training, so this is just FR1 schedule for mans. Mans emerge, problem behavior comes down. We're all happy. We reverse and we show that we're able to, in Dave Wacker's words, weak-ass treatment. But in this case, good experimental control. So we end with, this is a kid who's requesting things pretty consistently and not engaging in any problem behavior at that point. So what we determined was that, and these are some of the additional participants, I'm going to move quickly through these. So I said we determined that what we wanted to do is find an effective way to set the schedule for the SD and the S delta. And what we determined we would do is we would use the rate of mans in the original FCT, right? So if the child was emitting a man every 2 minutes, then we would use basically 50% of that. That was going to be our interval, 60 seconds. So it's going to be based on the rate of man. So if the child's only asking for stuff every 2 minutes, then the MO is probably only coming to strength every 2 minutes, and so you don't need to be switching every 45. You probably want it to be based more closely on the rate of the mans that were occurring. So in this case of this participant, it was about a 40-second intermanned interval, and so we based the rate of the switches, in this case, once every minute and 20 seconds, roughly. So this is kind of what that looked like. We would have a discriminative stimulus. As long as we got a functional communication response, we would also we also wanted to make sure that they were contacting that contingency. So the duration of the SD in this case was going to be, they had to contact that contingency at least 5 times. So instead of having 10-minute sessions, we ran it until the man was emitted in the presence of the SD 5 times. And then we would switch to the S delta. In the case of the S delta, we would use that predetermined period that I described earlier. Unless they engaged in problem behavior, we would reset the interval. As long as they weren't engaging in problem behavior for some period of time before the SD, we had that change overlay, and then we would switch back to SD. I'm going to move a little quickly, and I'm sorry for that, but I'm running out of time. I want to leave time for questions. So we would just kind of alternate between the SD and the S delta, and we would get a total time of 10 minutes in the presence of the S delta. We then would start to thin the schedule. As long as we got 2 consecutive sessions with no problem behavior and mans were low in the S delta, we would increase the S delta by 50%. We continue to do that until we hit a 10-minute total. So this is what that looked like in essence. We give it some time. We see initially there was problem behavior occurring in the presence of the S delta, not unexpected. That is, this is the time when you ask for stuff and you're not getting it, but eventually it comes down to a low rate. Mans are persisting in the presence of the SD, and we get a period of time where there were no mans in the S delta here. And we continue to thin the schedule and keep going until we get to our terminal goal. 15 minutes for this kid. We're able to say this kid can go 15 minutes without asking for anything. No problem behavior is occurring. This is what the parents were really looking at that point. And we saw these results replicated across a handful of kids without any resurgence of problem behavior. So again, this is just further evidence of how this multiple schedule is an important component, and it's not enough to just do FCT, but we've got to be thinking about what is this going to mean for the caregiver in the end, and what is that going to look like. A couple of other things, and I said we're running out of time, but I just want to wrap up with a few other things that we've started doing more on our clinical side. This is something that, again, we don't have a lot of data to show that it's effective, but we've kind of just feel like this is one of the right things to do. We used to get really frustrated when caregivers didn't consistently implement the interventions that we developed. I don't know if anybody else is in this world, right? You have teachers and you say, here's an intervention and it works, and I have data and I can show you that it works, and they say, yeah, not so interested, right? There's a Meatloaf song, right? So I'll make that relevant in just a second, right? Just making sure you're all paying attention. So when we see a family and when they first start with us, they all say, it's terrible. Like, problem behavior is so bad. I am super motivated. This is really, really severe. And they say, I would do anything to make this problem behavior go away. And then you design a treatment. And they say, I would do anything to make problem behavior go away, but I won't do that, right? And that's a real problem. And it's one of the most frustrating things that we encounter. This idea that we have something, we know it works, and the caregiver isn't willing to use it or is not using it effectively. Now, I used to really get frustrated with parents, but I also used to teach a rat lab at one point, and I would teach this rat lab to undergrads. And every semester I'd get some undergrad who would say, my rat's dumb. My rat can't learn to press the lever. I got the dumb rat. What's wrong? And I always told them, you can't blame the rat, right? It's not the rat's fault. You're setting the contingencies. If you can't shape that behavior, that's on you. So rather than getting upset with the parents and saying, you know what, they're not using the treatment, that's on them, right? The parent's the problem. I think we got to look at what we're doing and say, all right, we haven't gotten good enough yet as a science, and we're getting there, but we haven't gotten good enough yet that we can produce the types of treatments that produce the effects of the caregiver, that are reinforcing enough to maintain caregiver behavior and produce those effects as rapidly as we like. Remember those discounting data I showed earlier. We've got to be working on better and more rapid treatment effects and more significant treatment effects. One of the things that we've done to try to help with this, as I say, I don't have data on this. This is just something that I think that we've been trying to do, and hopefully it's helping. Under ideal circumstances, we present the caregiver with 3 different versions of our treatment, right? Treatment number 1, some version that's really intensive and that if implemented consistently is going to produce the most rapid reduction in problem behavior, but maybe really hard to do, right? This is the kind of thing that might take a lot. This might be your DRO, 1-minute schedule, whatever, right? But a really intensive intervention that hopefully when we tell them, look, when you have the time and the energy, this is the treatment we want you to do. The second treatment is a version that might be a little bit less intense, a little bit easier to do, a little more feasible, that is, but will probably produce more gradual reductions in problem behavior, but at least it's not going to make things worse, right? Let's make sure that at least you're not reinforcing problem behavior, right? Let's teach you to be able to do extinction all the time. Now, you may not be able to do everything all the time, but let's at least make sure you're not making things worse the rest of the time. And then a third treatment that is more of an antecedent-based strategy, oftentimes, not always, but oftentimes, where we're trying to eliminate the problem behavior from happening in the first place by eliminating the motivation, like try to wipe out the MO altogether. This would be, you know what, this kid has to go to the assembly. There's some dumb rule at the school that says he has to go to the assembly, and this kid hates noises, so let's just get him some noise-canceling headphones, right? Let's just make it so the problem behavior doesn't happen in the first place, right? And we'll work on that another time. But we can't allow problem behavior to happen. Another good example, we had a kid who would get very, very aggressive. The aggressive behavior was maintained by a positive reinforcement in the form of access to preferred music in this case. She would get really aggressive whenever music wasn't playing, especially her favorite music. And she'd attacked Dad from the back seat of the car before while they were driving at highway speed and pulled on a seatbelt and grabbed the steering wheel. Really, really dangerous stuff. What we said was, all right, here's a set of strategies that you can use, and we're going to teach you how to do extinction and all that great stuff. But driving on I-75 probably is not the time to work through an extinction burst, right? I remember Richard Fox one time said something that I thought was really cool. He said, I never use extinction with any kid higher than my belt buckle, right? And I think that's really great wisdom, right? Like that's the kind of thing that, yeah, maybe you can't do extinction, maybe we manipulate antecedents, especially in those times and those settings when we are not able to work through problem behavior. So this is something that I think, again, in terms of making our treatments more socially valid, would be really important. So again, treatment 1, do this when you're able. Treatment 2, do this when you can't do number 1. And number 3, do this when problem behavior just really can't even be tolerated. I'm getting towards the end here. I think one of the things that we as a profession need to really be careful about, and I think you maybe got this as I was talking about antecedent, or measuring behavior on the front end or setting goals. It's probably not enough to measure just whether or not a goal has been achieved when treatment's being implemented under those analog conditions. Again, we saw 80% reductions in a session room that looks nothing like the home or the classroom, for example. Or when treatment is being implemented under ideal circumstances, it's implemented at full strength. Claire St. Peter has done some of this work looking at how robust is our treatment to threats to internal validity. And we really need to be doing a better job of figuring out, is this treatment still going to work when it's kind of done halfway? Because how is it going to get done? Probably about halfway. So we need to know that before we actually send someone home or send someone off into the world without a treatment, or with a treatment that may be difficult to do at 100% strength. I think we need to measure more meaningful outcomes as well. As I said, I think that Tris Smith has spoken to this in the past in some ways that I've found really helpful. Has a change in behavior occurred after several months of implementation in the natural environment by the caregiver? Well, we need to be thinking about, that's probably the thing that we're really interested in, not what did things look like 10 minutes after he walked out of my clinic, right? I want to know how the treatment maintained over time, and I want to start measuring some collateral things. I think if we're really treating severe behavior and we're doing a great job, this kid should master more IEP goals, right? Because now they can teach him in a more efficient way than they could before. So maybe we need to start measuring things like IEP skill mastery for the kids who we're treating for severe problem behavior. It's not necessarily the thing that we think of first, but these are the collateral things that really matter. Can the mom, again, Can the mom go to the store? Can they leave him with his grandma? These are the types of things that I think we need to do a better job of measuring more consistently. One thing, our kind of feeble attempt to accomplish this, we've developed a severity scale. We get a lot of kids who come into our clinic, and we have different clinical services like I described before. We got outpatient clinics, we got day treatment units, we got several things in between. And when we first did this, one of the things we realized real quickly is, all right, now we got to sort kids. We got to figure out who needs the big daddy intensive treatment, who needs the kind of 1, 2, 3 visits in an outpatient clinic. How do we get the kids into the right level of service? Well, the thing to do is to base it on the severity, right? The kids with the really severe behavior, they need the really intensive intervention. The kids who it's not that bad, they could probably go outpatient. And so initially we said, well, let's try to figure out how we're going to measure severity. So we sat around, we got a bunch of people who thought they were really smart, myself included, and tried to figure out, well, what's more severe, for example, self-injury or pica, right? Well, pica, I guess, right? Well, what if the self-injury happens 20 times a day? Well, maybe what you find really quickly is if you try to do it structurally, you're not going to get there. Topography is going to be impossible to measure severity. So instead, we try to measure our model or base our model on the functional property or the functional effects of the behavior, right? So from our perspective, a behavior that requires a child to be in a one-on-one setting in a classroom where there are no other students around is more severe than a behavior that allows the child to be integrated with other classmates, right? Regardless of the topography. Self-injury that puts someone in the hospital is more severe than pica that doesn't, right? And basing it on the effect that that behavior is having on the child and on their caregivers and on their situation. And we thought about this in 3 main ways. First, we thought about it in terms of how it's affecting the household and the daily routine. So again, this is just a questionnaire. We do an observation, we do an interview, and then based on that, the clinician completes this. So for example, a behavior that doesn't interfere with typical family and household routines, that would be a 1. Where a 5 would be something like this child is in a restrictive educational setting, they have a one-on-one, they're in a residential placement. These types of things would be something more like a 5. And then we've got several in between. And I know there's a question I'll get to in just a second. I'm going to get through this. Physical injury would be another. If the behavior is not causing any physical harm to the individual versus someone's been hospitalized or someone's going to die if they keep doing this, that's a 5, right? And we have several levels in between. Property damage. There's been no property damage versus most of the time this behavior happens, the police get called, right? That would be an example of a more severe type of a behavior. And then we look at how intensive the intervention has to be. People can basically get by okay versus the example I gave you earlier. This is a parent who has to stay within arm's reach of the child at all times. They're never able to leave them alone, etc. They have to wear protective equipment, these kinds of things. So to sum up, I think our science is very, very powerful. I think we have all the data in the world to show that. I think we've demonstrated that when we direct this science towards the problem of dealing with the problem behaviors exhibited by folks with developmental disabilities, we're the best game in town and by a mile, right? But we probably need to stop patting ourselves on the back and get to work and figure out how we can take that science and apply it in better ways to produce more meaningful outcomes for the clients that we work with. And that's what I got for you today. Thank you for your attention. So I know there's one question online, and then I think John's got one as well. The iPad battery died, so can you read it to me?
Advantages to the method for establishing a multiple schedule presented in this talk included what?
Yoking the duration of the S delta, and this is going to sound a little technical, yoking the duration of the S delta to the rate of MANS in functional communication training, and inserting a changeover delay between problem behavior and the transition to the SD. And we've presented those data at ABA, and hopefully those data are going to be impressed pretty soon. Over here, yeah.
Would you be able to go back a few slides?
Sure.
And to the one,
Whoops.
The one I'm interested in is the one where you had the 3 levels. You had what if you did intensive and it worked right away?
Right.
Is that the one?
Yes, I think so. You tell me, is this the one?
Yeah, that's it.
Okay.
I'm interested in the number 1. And I'm interested in it from the perspective of sort of an engineering approach of what would it take to get people to do number 1,
Yeah.
as opposed to, well, let's just throw it out there and see if they do number 1. And I'm thinking about this because I seem to remember, this was a few years ago, that some of the computer companies were interested in knowing how people used computers in their homes. And they started off just asking people how they used computers in their homes. This was maybe 5 years ago. And then somebody said, well, why don't we watch them and see what they do? And they hired a woman I'm thinking this was Microsoft. They hired a woman who was an ethologist. And instead of studying people, primitive tribes in Africa or something, they went into the homes and they just kind of watched what people did. And it seems to me that it would be useful to find out, you just go in with your team and you do what you normally do to try to accomplish number one, but then you've got this other person who stays around and watches. So now the team leaves and that person just kind of stays there to see exactly what happens hour after hour. You know, are they pretty good the first hour? And then something happens, and then by bedtime it's all completely broken down, or you know exactly what happened. And if you approached it from an engineering perspective, maybe you could figure out some other way that you could get it to support. Because really, ethically, number one is that's what we really need to do. We need to give these people relief, especially from some of those cases you were describing, like the kid with the magnets and you know that kind of stuff. We really kind of owe it to them to give them this sort of thing. I'm also thinking of something in terms of safety engineering. There was a time when seatbelts first came out, and the problem was people wouldn't wear them. And so there was lots of stuff about how do you get people to wear them. And the automobile companies went through variations of, well, there's going to be this buzzer, and there's an interlock, and then I remember having one car when you got in, it automatically.
Ones, yeah.
And people, they didn't like that.
Nope. I hated
And
that.
so what did they do? They ended up with airbags. So now, even if you don't have your seatbelt on, that just keeps you from being thrown out of the car. But the solution really was airbags. And eventually people got to the point that they started doing buckle up. But anyway, I think number one ought to be our, you know, good housekeeping seal of approval on this.
Yeah, and I don't disagree with you at all. I think one of the things that I didn't talk about was, you know, from our perspective, one of the areas of research that we need to do is exactly what you're describing. How do we get people to do number one, right? And I think that there's literature out there that has shown that we can get people to do hard things. Smoking cessation. There's a ton of research on smoking cessation. I've never had to quit smoking, but people tell me it's really hard to do. And yet, there are folks out there who've done good behavior analytic work figuring out how to get people to do that. And I think that that's an area that needs to be done and explored more thoroughly, absolutely. On your other point, you know, one of the things that I didn't talk about, but we do something kind of close to what you're describing. So when we have a treatment that we've got these 3 treatments that we're going to train caregivers to implement, right? All of our caregivers, they have to demonstrate 90% procedural fidelity before we'll even go into the home to work with them, right? So they come into the clinic, we got a treatment, we got the data to show it works, they come in, we train them, they got to show 90% procedural fidelity. Then we go into the home to make sure that we're able to kind of generalize those treatments into that environment. We take a couple of days up to a week to make sure that that's working well. And it used to be, that was it, right? That was the point at which they said, all right, they can do it, and we've demonstrated that it works in the home, we're done. Now, about 2 years ago, one of the things we did was we said, all right, this is one of those things, Dr. Call has to be able to sleep at night kinds of things, right? And this is, I don't have data for this, but it was just, we knew we needed to do better than that because we would see these families call up 6 months later and say, treatment's not working. We say, well, what are you doing? And they describe it, and it was unrecognizable. It wasn't anything close to what we were describing. So what we started doing is providing a lot more follow-up services. Ideally, what I like to see happen is that our last visit in the home, as I say, as part of that initial admission, is on a Friday, and someone comes out to the house on a Monday, right? And we do 6 months of follow-up, but initially they're doing a weekly visit in the home. Now, one of the first things that we found, these are not quantitative data, but it's the best data I have. The first time we did this, again, Friday, they have 90% procedural fidelity, it's working in the home, come out on Monday, treatment's gone to hell. I mean, like 2 days, it's completely annihilated this treatment. And I'm thinking, well, what would have happened if we hadn't been there? So we do that weekly visit initially. We fade out over the 6 months so that we go from weekly to bi-weekly, and then the last 2 visits are a month apart. And we found that that's really critical to what you're talking about, getting those treatments to maintain. Even so, though, I would argue, you know, if we tell a parent, hey, this, because one of the things that's difficult sometimes is the Venn diagram of, you know, what treatments will work and produce the desired effect, and what's easy to do or what a caregiver is likely to find acceptable. Sometimes there is a sliver of overlap in those things. Sometimes there's no overlap at all. That's a different problem. But I think that if we can say, hey, look, there is a little bit of overlap, and there's more overlap than we even have to have, and we maybe have choices here. There's a couple of treatments here that are going to make a difference for this family. Let's give them options instead of saying, you got to do the roughest, toughest, hardest thing there is that's out there. Let's give them options, because until we have that research that shows how to get people to do hard things a little bit better than we've done, For example, a lot of that smoking cessation stuff shows that if you pay people to quit smoking, they'll quit smoking some of the time, right? But I don't have that in my budget yet. I'll let you know when that happens. We'll all go out and never mind. But I think that you're absolutely right. I agree with you, and I think that we need to do better at A, getting treatments that work rapidly, that produce the kinds of effects that we want. B, supporting the families to make sure that they're implementing it consistently and that we're able to be there when there's drift or behavior drift, either drift in the caregiver's behavior or the kid's behavior, right? Because both of those things can happen.
Just a real quick follow-up.
Yeah, is there anything online, any questions that we need to answer? Great. They all fell asleep. They all turned it off, turn off their monitors. Yeah.
Just to make my point here, I understand what you're saying about family support. That's not what I'm asking about. I'm talking about the research, the science of what happens to cause the degradation.
Right.
So you go into the home, they're at 95% or 100%
Sure.
at 9 o'clock in the morning. Okay, somebody's taking data on this stuff. At what point does it start to degrade? We're not talking about family support. It starts to degrade, and why? What was
Right.
happening in there? And really trying to understand sort of the ecology of behavior analysis implementation in the home. I mean, we don't
I
pay attention
agree.
to
I think anybody here working on a PhD and they need a dissertation project? Because I think you just heard one right there. I mean, that's exactly the kind of stuff that needs to get done. I agree. I mean, it's difficult. That's difficult research to do right now. And oftentimes the most important stuff is. But I totally agree. That's a question well worth answering and would have a huge impact, I think, on our field.
All right, if this was the Oscars, we'd